built on. Now that we understand how force, velocity, and acceleration all interact, you have some basic equations that as long as you have body weight and timing data over perspective splits from 0 to 40 yards, you can start to actually create these analyses yourself. But let's look at how does an athlete go about optimizing their acceleration technique, and start by looking at the technical model. Now, the best way to observe a technical model is seeing it done for real. So let's take a look at one of our athletes accelerating. Provide some context around what you're seeing, deconstruct it, and then we'll kick back into showing you a video again. So this athlete that we're observing right here actually was able to run roughly 4.41 seconds at the Pro Football Combine. You'll notice a couple things. The angle of the body is severe. The leg action is piston-like, and the arms and legs are beautifully coordinated together. As we see the individual move, it's only roughly at that 20-yard mark that we see a distinct rise in posture. Now, while every step here subsequently drives the rise of the body, that total rise, that vertical position that we typically see during max velocity, isn't achieved to 20 yards. So now we're not only seeing data from some of the previous slides, but also video evidence that 20 yards, especially for elite individuals, is roughly that zone where acceleration occurs. This will be critical in describing the attributes that allow the athlete to optimize that process. Let's start now by deconstructing the entire linear speed model. We're going to use 40 yards. And the simple reason we're going to use 40 yards is because it allows us to capture all the zones necessary to have a complementary discussion around linear speed. What does that mean? Well, from 0 to 20 yards, we can really start to articulate what is happening from a start and acceleration perspective. Past 20 yards, we can look at that transition into max velocity. And for many athletes, anything past 30 yards potentially starts to feed into speed endurance. Especially for court and field sport athletes, it's a long enough distance for us to capture and develop all the important linear speed qualities. So when we think about 0 to 10 yards, what should be happening? Well, roughly the first 6 contacts should happen in the first 10 yards. Now, I'm modeling this based on Pro Football Combine data and typically what we see in elite sprinters. Therefore, probably plus or minus 1 step is called for in each of these zones, but it starts to give you some accurate understanding of actually how many steps should take place. Past 10 yards, from 10 to 20, we see our additional steps get taken all the way up to roughly step 11. If we look at any athlete who's running sub 4.5, 40-yard sprints, they're only taking roughly 11 steps to about that 20-yard mark. Once we see athletes going from 4.5, 4.6 and above over 40 yards, you'll see that kick into 12 and sometimes 13 steps based on their technique. Past that step 11, we really see, as we will soon see, a distinct change in posture. Starts to rise, instead of piston-like, is more cyclical-like. Therefore, from 20 to 30 yards, we start to see the evolution of max velocity, or what we call absolute speed. And typically that's contacts 12 through 16. So in a lot of our elite runners, again, 4.4 or better, they're only taking 4 to 5 contacts over that 10-yard period. Right? Match that. That's 2 less contacts than they were taking over the first 10 yards. And then finally, 30 to 40 yards, assuming the individual is not slowing down, and anybody who's in a big skill or skill-type position at the Pro Football Combine is not slowing down at this stage in the race, they're roughly making their contacts 17 through 20. So some of our athletes are taking as low as 3 to 4 steps over that last 10 yards. Others are taking as high as 5, again, strictly based on technique and how much they weigh. So if we look at this is what should be happening, this is also, as we will soon discuss, how we should test it. Because each of these zones correlate differently, not only to strength qualities, but also fundamental movement skills. Let's start to define what those zones actually look like. We're going to break those zones into 2 distinct areas, what we're going to call the acceleration zone and the absolute speed zone. And again, in our next presentation, we'll dive into the absolute speed zone in a bit more detail. So within our acceleration zone, we have 2 different phases. We have the start phase, which really is representative of the first 3 steps. So we can see those first 3 steps are flashing because those are really hallmarked by the start, because the kinetics and kinematics that occur in those first 3 steps is very much so different than all subsequent steps. From there then, we can look at this transitional phase, or what some might call secondary acceleration. And that's typically contacts 4 through 11 up to 12, and terminates roughly at 20 yards. Therefore, instead of thinking of acceleration only through 10, we really need to think of this technique and what's happening up through 20 yards. And then finally, your final steps, roughly 12 to 20 plus steps based on the distance, make up max velocity. And again, we're going to define max velocity as achieving over 80% of your max velocity. The reason we're defining it that way is once you're at 80% of your max speed, you are in what we call absolute speed type technique. Therefore, you have the physics definition of acceleration and velocity, and then we have the technical definition of acceleration and max velocity running technique. Now, when we take all this, let's actually bring it to life looking at some Pro Football Combine data. In this case, we have 4 different athletes. We have Brandin Cooks, Odell Beckham, Jadeveon Clowney, and Greg Robinson. You can see each of these individuals are at drastically different body weights. Cooks weighs roughly 189 pounds. Beckham weighs roughly 198 pounds. Clowney weighed 266 pounds. And Robinson weighed roughly 332 pounds. You can see all of their 40 times there at the bottom. Let's start by contrasting Cooks and Beckham. Number one, first thing, they're about 10 pounds different. We can see that their initial acceleration phase is very similar, but fundamentally, Brandin Cooks was able to ramp up a little bit faster. By 20 yards, Brandin Cooks was going roughly 20 miles per hour. Again, we can see it's articulated by that sudden increase in velocity acceleration, and even in the 40, from 20 now to 40 yards, we see that rise in velocity is much slower. We can also see within Brandin Cooks, he was able to increase his velocity better, in this case, than Odell Beckham. Hence the reason he was able to achieve a 40 in 4.33 seconds, whereas Beckham was able to achieve it in 4.43 seconds, roughly 1/10 difference. Funny enough, though, both of them achieved 23 miles per hour by the end of the race. So if they continued going over, let's say, 60 yards, the race might have been different. Hence the reason, just because someone's good at a short distance doesn't mean they're necessarily good at a long distance. Each of these take different technical and strength demands. Now what is interesting is look at Clowney's numbers. He's a heavier individual. Therefore, it took him longer to accelerate. Again, within acceleration and the force I can generate relative to body weight, we know he weighs significantly more. He's in the nature of 70 pounds more than those previous gentlemen. But look at what happens. His ability to close from 30 to 40 yards is unbelievable. Correlate that to his capacity as a football player, and we see why he's such a threatening and important defensive end and linebacker. He was able to achieve equal to those lighter guys going 23 miles per hour. And arguably, from 30 yards to 50 yards, he might in fact have been able to run faster than them. And this brings forth an important concept when it comes to body weight. We know that from a correlational perspective, relative strength, therefore pound for pound, how much force can I exhibit into the ground is number one when it comes to effective acceleration. Simply put, those lighter individuals had a higher relative strength capacity, therefore they could accelerate faster. But once they were all up to speed, once everyone was going 22 miles per hour, the individual who has the higher mass and the higher total strength is able to continue that speed. And in that case, it was Clowney. We see that through the light that from 30 to 40 yards, he was able to be as fast as individuals running roughly 1/10 to 2/10 faster than him. What is equally, if not even more impressive, is an individual in Greg Robinson at 332 pounds. While he doesn't get to 20 miles per hour, he still gets to an incredible 18 miles per hour as an offensive lineman by 20 yards. We still see the distinct trend of acceleration, reinforcing why 0 to 20 is our acceleration zone. But we also notice that his ability to increase his velocity simply because of his body weight and the technical capacity of a body that big isn't as good as our other 3 players. But still, unbelievable that he is able to achieve 21 miles per hour. Again, reinforcing as a tackle that needs to pull within pro football, he has that capacity to get around the corner and make the block. All of these individuals, their difference in speed relates to the kinetics and kinematics in which they can exhibit within their acceleration and max velocity running, and we can see how important body weight is to this entire equation. So oftentimes, again, the best way to improve acceleration is to factor in nutritional qualities and body composition because it plays equal parts in all other factors that we're going to discuss. Now that we have a full, comprehensive understanding of the physics involved, the technical model, and how it should be structured from 0 to 40 yards as a construct, let's actually nail in deep and start looking at acceleration itself from a technical perspective. We want to start by identifying 2 central goals. Number one, We want to synchronize explosive arm and leg movement through a piston-like leg action that maximizes a low leg swing. When it comes to acceleration, I'm already at 0 meters per second. I'm going nowhere, which means I need to maximize my time on the ground. We know with every subsequent step after I start, I have less and less time on the ground. And the less time I have on the ground, the less capacity to generate force. The less capacity to generate force, the less I can continue my acceleration. Therefore, piston-like leg action keeps a low leg swing, minimizes excessive vertical air time, allowing me to spend the most time on the ground, thereby putting the most force in the ground, optimizing my acceleration. We absolutely know, especially if you look at Jamaican sprinters, faster sprinters have a strong piston-like action and keep their legs low, especially in the first 3 steps that we classify as the start. Technical goal number 2, optimize the direction of force in an effort to maximize horizontal velocity. We know that both vertical and horizontal velocity is critical, but specifically, as we'll show, the technical model that we're going to teach is defined and identified with maximizing horizontal force, because it is only the horizontal force into the ground that actually projects our body from a velocity and acceleration perspective. Now, to bring this to life, we want to discuss 3 critical positions. Throughout this entire presentation, you'll notice a reference, Mann 2011. The majority of this data comes from the incredible work of Dr. Ralph Mann, and I want to give him credit within this certification because what he has done to improve our knowledge of acceleration and absolute speed is profound. And while we are presenting this information to you, it has absolutely been influenced by Dr. Ralph Mann. So I encourage you, look at the references, pick up his book because it's one of the most powerful references for both of our linear speed presentations. So, critical position number 1, let's start to look at the actual start. Now, many of these specific recommendations do come out of track, but the fact of the matter is, in our experience at Exos, we can utilize this information to maximize our knowledge of linear speed. Because if I want to be the best at sprinting straight ahead, I want to learn and study the best at sprinting straight ahead, which obviously in this case is sprinters. So let's start by the orientation. This is oftentimes one of the strongest mistakes that I see and we see made within the actual start, and that's how far we are away from the line. A general recommendation that Dr. Mann gives is the back leg should be roughly 100%, and therefore the front foot should be 60% of that in terms of the orientation. Whether you are in blocks or on the ground, this orientation we have found to be true. You also want to notice that if you were to drop your front knee down to the ground, it should hit slightly on or in front of the line. We do not want to crowd that line, and we definitely don't want our foot and hand on the same line. And as we like to tell the athletes, you trade inches for angles. If I move you back just a little bit with this 60-100 orientation, I can get a better lean, and as we'll soon see, coming out of this stance at 38 to 45 degrees is how you maximize acceleration, especially from a static position. Now, let's move into where your leg should actually be. If we look at your hip should be roughly, back hip, about 94 degrees. Again, the best athletes have this open hip position where they can explode off the ground very rapidly. Think back to the graph I showed on the 3-point and block start. That back leg has to create a massive magnitude of force from the get-go. So we want it in a mechanically advantageous position. All the while, that back knee should be about 133 degrees. Oftentimes, a common mistake will be to bend that back knee to 90 degrees when in fact we want to open it up. Now, I will say this, you have a little play here. If you have a weaker athlete, they will be more comfortable with more bend in the back knee. So that's fine initially. Inevitably, we want to try to open them up to this mechanically advantageous position, pushing closer to a 133-degree knee angle in that back leg. If we now look at the front leg, we want to see that that hip is about 47 degrees. As we can see in this picture, it's a much more coiled tight position. Hence the reason, hip flexion, hip flexion, hip flexion. You've got to crank your hip mobility. Athletes cannot get into these severe positions in sport or in sprinting unless they can create enough torque in the hip and neutral position in the hip to have the body in the right position to actually push from. If he doesn't have that mobility, his back is rounded and his stable platform to push from is absolutely gone. And then that front knee we want to see roughly at 93 degrees. Again, that 90-degree sweet spot for the front leg is why initially in the push, the mechanical advantage is low, but what do we notice in our graph on force? We saw that force increase once they start pushing out. This starts to help them once they get to a mechanically advantageous position. So if they can lock in all these angles, hold 1/1000, to 1,000 starts help them create an optimized acceleration capacity. Now, for many of you at home, you might not work with individuals that have a utility to get into a three-point stance. So can you still teach the same concepts of angle, lean, and optimizing mechanical advantage of the hip, knee, and ankle in a two-point start or various other start types? Absolutely. Take this data, extrapolate it, put them in a two-point start, or try other variations. If you want someone to jog and sprint, come from a push-up and sprint. There's all these different variations. What we want to focus on in this presentation are the actual technical attributes that we're trying to see achieved in critical positions. Note that in our actual practical, we'll spend a bit more time discussing the two-point start for those of you that use that a bit more at home. Now, once someone is out of that start position, we then want to look into our critical position 2, and that's what we call ankle cross. Now, every athlete, whether they're in a two-point start, a three-point start, out of the blocks, or jogging to sprinting, will have some level of an ankle cross. And basically, it's the position that when the ankle crosses the down ankle, or said another way, the ankle in flight that crosses the down ankle on the ground, that's what we call the ankle cross position. Now, where the legs are relative to one another tells us how good their technique in this stage is. Recalling, what are we trying to do? We're trying to optimize piston-like leg action, and we're trying to have a low leg swing to minimize unneeded flight time to maximize force in the ground. So a couple things that we're looking for once this push and this ankle cross begins. Number one, we want the body and that shin to be parallel. And I would argue that that parallel reference point of body to shin is a constant all the way through that 20-yard mark. Even once they start approaching a more upright position, as that foot strikes down and through the ground, we should see that shin and body parallel because the direction of force and the magnitude drives where they're moving from a horizontal perspective. Therefore, you'd expect the stability by which the legs pull on to be aligned with the direction of the legs. From here, then, we should see that that back knee, as it crosses the ankle, again, not above the ankle, not dragging on the ground, but crosses next to it, roughly 69 to 79 degrees. So literally, when you're doing your high-speed video analysis and you're watching sprinting over those first 3 steps, you want those legs to cross one another at the ankle nice and low, calling it a low leg sweep. So in this, we can see my directional angle here is driving that foot, or as we like to say, the laces, toward the direction I'm going. That maximizes the low leg swing, and sometimes almost cueing them to almost drag their foot on the ground helps to keep that low position the entire time. From here then, that should result in an optimized angle of projection. And when we look at both our Pro Football Combine athletes to elite sprinters, that projection angle is roughly 38 to 43 degrees. Now obviously, if they're already running, so they have a certain level of velocity, or they're coming out of a two-point start, or a variation of a two-point start, are they going to have this level of lean, or should we encourage them to fall to achieve this level of lean? Absolutely not. Lean is directly proportional to how fast you're going. Therefore, if I'm already moving at speed, do I need to be at as much of an angle? Absolutely not. So consider that when you're utilizing this information. The final position that we want to discuss is toe off and contact. Now, this is the position that has high utility for everybody watching this at home. If you work with anybody on acceleration, this is the position, whether out of a two-point or out of a three-point or off the blocks, the athlete should be achieving over those first 11 to 12 steps. Now, in looking at this, will the body angle be the same the entire time? No, but how the legs interact relative to the body, that should stay relatively constant all the way up to that 20-yard mark. So let's look at a couple critical attributes. Number one, the back leg needs to only be at about 40 degrees of bend. Therefore, it's at a 160-degree angle. Well, why is that? Well, if I completely lock out and extend my back knee and jam that joint, I'm actually going to have apprehension in that push. There'll be inhibition of the system. And in fact, your faster athletes are already going to start leaving the ground before they've achieved terminal knee extension. Therefore, it is an absolute myth that we need to achieve 180 degrees in that back knee. Not the case. We want to leave a little bit of something on the ground because that tells you that they're pushing enough. Now, with that said, if there's a massive bend in that back knee and they're not maximizing that back leg extension, do we need to coach them to explode off the ground, push the ground away to achieve these angles? You better believe it. But understand it's a balance of not too much complete extension, but definitely not being too bent. Now let's take a look at the front leg. We want that front knee to be about 90 degrees or less. Again, if we crack open the can, as I like to say, and that knee is more than 90 degrees, look at where the foot position would be. They'd be in a position to cast forward, striking well in front of their center of mass. causing them to have to pull the ground to them. One, not running very fast, but two, predisposing their hamstring for some level of injury. So again, we want to keep that ankle, or if you would, those laces tucked nice and tight. As if it's the Trojan horse going in, we want to keep that foot in the Trojan horse. Keep it locked and back, coiled in. Don't let them kick open. We don't want to kick the front door in. From there, once we understand the back leg position, we understand the front leg position, we know that that ankle absolutely needs to be locked, as we like to say, trigger up, because that's what delivers the message into the ground. Now let's look at actually how the legs should interact. We keep talking about piston-like action, and that is meant to contrast a cyclical type action that we will see during absolute speed. Therefore, from a coaching perspective, they should focus on driving their knee straight forward through that low leg drag as if to smash through a pane of glass. All the while, as they're driving that leg forward to smash that pane of glass, they need to be driving that front leg back. Those need to synchronize, creating this linear piston-like action, no fluff, no cyclical action. Only after that third step should we start seeing a remnants of the legs cycling together. So even though we're talking acceleration, does a slight cyclical action start to occur? Yes, but only after that third step. Up through that first three, let's say up to five maybe, we need the piston-like leg action the entire time. And if I am effective in the air through a strong pillar for those legs to pull on and they can coordinate together, then my foot strike should occur under my center of mass to slightly behind. They've actually shown in elite sprinters the contact point is slightly behind the center of mass for the first two steps. Again, correlate this to the velocity and force data that I have shared, and we see that makes sense. How else would they achieve half of their maximal velocity by the end of their second step? You put all of these technical contributions together, plus take the next section on coaching, we will absolutely be able to influence acceleration at the highest level within the session, but in a way that transfers to the field and to the court. Let's now look at what should be happening from a force perspective. Those are all the kinematics. That's the motion that leads to proper acceleration, but what actually should be the fruits of the labor? What should result from those proper movement patterns? Let's look at two force velocity goals. Number one, we want to generate as much horizontal force as possible in the least amount of time while maximizing technique. Again, at the end of the day, the technique leads to the force generation in the ground, and specifically, technique needs to lead to the right direction of the right magnitude of force. Number two, optimize the horizontal force that can be generated in excess of vertical force needed to overcome gravity. As we will soon show, is vertical force important in acceleration? 100%. If I don't generate adequate vertical force, what happens to me? I fall straight on my face. Therefore, horizontal force is always in excess of the vertical force needed to keep me going. Hence the reason, the more total force you can produce, the more force that can go to the horizontal direction. Therefore, I can get you stronger, but also give you a lighter frame. Hence the reason body weight is so important. Average sprinters weigh 170 to 172 pounds, opposed to our skilled football players weighing upwards of 190 plus pounds. They need the armor to play the game. Now, if we have proper technique, as we showed in those previous slides, what are the actual force characteristics? Well, let's frame up who we're talking about relative to our physics section. We have a 180-pound athlete. Again, that relates to roughly 81.81 kilos, rounded up to 82. Just standing on the ground, they need 800 newtons of force to keep them upright. Now, let's also imagine that they covered their start in 0.45 seconds. What does that mean? That means a person is in a three-point stance, and it takes them 0.45 seconds from the second they start moving to the second their back foot is off the ground. I have actually calculated this with countless of our skilled players, and again, the average time to come out of a three-point for the foot to then leave the ground is 0.45 seconds. So we're getting real data here relative to pro football combine type athletes for the 40-yard dash. Let's look at a couple characteristics. Number one, for an athlete to effectively project out and therefore hit that 38 to 45 degree angle, they need to create first a certain level of vertical force. Literally, they need to be able to move their body upward 0.8 to 1 meters per second, which means they need a vertical miles per hour of 1.8 to 2.2 miles per hour. Literally, their body needs to rise that fast. And again, that makes sense. Think of anybody coming out of a start. Do they stay low like Superman? No, they rise out of it like a jet. So we need a certain level of vertical velocity. Therefore, we need enough force not only to overcome body weight, which is what? Yes, 800 newtons, but also enough force to generate that 1 meter per second. So let's do the calculation. We have 800 newtons, there's your body weight. It takes roughly 145 newtons to move the body vertically at 1 meter per second in that timeline, giving us a net vertical force of 945 newtons, which, look at that, 212 pounds, well above body weight. And again, that makes sense. Body weight, we know that has to be achieved. They have to be able to create in excess of that. Let's now see what is left for horizontal force if I was to achieve that start clearance in 0.45 seconds. So now when we look at the horizontal force, we can see what's left. Well, roughly, this individual would have to generate 614 newtons of horizontal force relative to that vertical force to achieve that 0.45 second timeline that we typically see in athletes running 4.4 or better. That relates to roughly 138 pounds. Now you're probably thinking, wow, the horizontal force is less than body weight and the vertical force is above body weight. Why then is horizontal force so important? Well, at the end of the day, vertical force is standard. That has to be produced. Therefore, the linchpin in effective acceleration is the ability to optimize, even though it's lower than body weight, that horizontal force in the back end. Better athletes can take more of their total force or more percentage of their total force relative to body weight and push it back. Hence the reason it is not only the technique, the strength, but also the body weight of the athlete that takes all these pieces together that allows optimized horizontal force and therefore optimized horizontal acceleration. If I'm effective at doing this, this allows me to achieve an actual velocity of 3.38 meters per second at toe off, which for everyone at home is 7.6 miles per hour. Again, just under half of their velocity. By their second step, they'll be at over half of that velocity, even within a 40-yard dash. Imagine now how important it is for acceleration within sport, because they're achieving such high velocities. If we can improve even just the first start, even just the first step, it is absolutely a game changer in field and court sports. So, when we look at this, let's give you final characteristics to complement, because we couldn't go over every single position that is important for acceleration. So here's your major characteristic considerations when talking about the acceleration phase of sprinting. Number one, the frequency, which is contacts per second. Out of the start, and again, you don't need to calculate this, but here's some information. Out of the start, the contacts are roughly 2.5 to 3 contacts a second from the very get-go. From step 1 and beyond, it inevitably achieves 5 contacts a second when we start talking about absolute speed. We actually look at the length of the position. From a start perspective, we want the optimal distance to be about 1 yard. Now, oftentimes, when people look at the first step, they put 1 yard from the actual start line. No. Put that 1 yard from the first foot. Actually look at where they're pushing from. Therefore, do people need to project 1 yard past the start line? No. If they were to do that, what would they do? They'd have to maximize all that vertical velocity and therefore getting airtime, which negates what we're looking for in acceleration. Therefore, that shorter first step is okay up to those first 2 to 3 steps. Inevitably, our step lengths achieve 2.7 yards, approaching just under 10 feet or just over 10 feet in certain cases. Unbelievable, the stride length of a person like Usain Bolt at that 70-meter mark. Ground time should roughly be 0.3 to 0.5 seconds in the initial start. And again, from the start of movement till their feet come off the ground, that's what we mean by start time. Recall in our previous section, we discussed 0.45 seconds being the average for a skilled player running probably 4.5, 4.4 or better out of their start. Inevitably, those contact times approach 0.1 seconds. Elite sprinters are on the ground for 0.087 seconds, 87 milliseconds. Just goes to show how important force, direction, and velocity are. And then finally, flight time, you can see it here, 0.05 to 0.07 seconds of flight time out of the start. You can see how fast that is. We don't want them spending time in the air. It is only once they're at max velocity that we should see their air time stabilize at about 0.127 seconds. And I found this to be the case both in elite and sub-elite type sprinters. They spend about the same amount of time in the air, which we can see should be significantly longer relative to that actual start phase. Let's take another look now at a video now that you have all of your information on how acceleration should be applied. And here we have a fellow athlete that looked very similar to the initial athlete that I showed. Look at the body posture, fixed. Arms and legs move around the body. Body doesn't move around the arms and legs. Arms hammer the legs as if to nail something into the ground. We see piston action, but right after that third step, what do we notice? they start to become a bit more cyclical till right at that 20-yard, we see transition to absolute speed. So look, piston, push, piston, push, piston, push, cycle starts to begin, body starts to rise, but the still fundamental capacity to drive forces at an angle is relevant all the way through that 11th step, or 20 yards. Continue to understand that your physics help to drive the technique that we teach on the field and on the court. So in looking at that was a ton of information. So let's take some time now to digest that with our first check for learning. Go ahead and write down 1 to 2 sentences discussing how velocity, acceleration, and force all interact to optimize speed. Try to put it into your own words if you can. Write down the 3 primary phases observed in the 40-yard sprint, remembering that acceleration has 2 subphases, and then we have absolute speed. And then finally, let's write down 2 goals for optimizing the acceleration phase of sprinting, considering both technical demands as well as overall force characteristics.